Firstly, on the issue of globalisation, you've been quite a fierce critic of free trade. Why are you opposed to it?
Well, you have to ask yourself, free trade for who? Who is it free for? And who does free trade really benefit? I mean, for instance, as we are talking about promoting free trade in the Pacific, these are small island economies. Many of these small island economies dependent on revenue generated from import duties. Now, free trade is asking that those import duties be reduced or the tariffs be removed. And there is a global push for that. When that happens, what will happen to those small island nations that depend on those revenues? Where are they going to get their revenues from? Well, they've been told that if that's the case, then they must impose GST. So they impose GST, and they've transferred the liability to the people. Whereas in the past, the liability was borne by the companies that were engaged in import-export type businesses. So now the people are paying more taxes, and the very nature of business is such that profit margins will continue to increase in an effort to minimize the overheads and in an effort to therefore make more money. If that's the case, then businesses are not going to reduce their prices merely because you've removed the tariffs. Those prices will still remain. My point here is that free trade does not benefit the people of the Pacific. The people of the Pacific live on their own land. They are self-sustaining already. But if you impose free trade, then you are going to take away the opportunities that they have to be truly economically independent. For instance, free trade proposes to also relax labor laws and migration laws, which means people from more developed nations can bring in their companies and operate in those small economies. The companies in those economies will not be able to compete with these large companies, basically because of the economic cost of doing business. The small companies are going to be killed off. That's what will happen. And then where will those people go? Where will those companies go? What will they do? And the United Nations, in the meantime, is promoting an informal sector. But the informal sector allows the people to be engaged at a lower level of business. They virtually become salesmen for junk from China and Southeast Asia on the streets, selling flex cards and multiple, super glue and DVD and whatever crap that they can buy in the shops. Meanwhile, big business such as resource exploitation is taken care of by large multinational companies who also fight for tax exemptions and customs duty exemptions. So they are virtually in an economy doing very little for that economy, but generating a lot of profit for their shareholders. I am basically saying that free trade has to be very carefully negotiated. Negotiated in such a way that the economic activities that are taking place in the Pacific Island economies must benefit the Pacific Islands. So, because with liberalization of trade barriers, they are also asking for the relaxing of banking laws. When you relax banking laws, it basically allows those multinational companies to channel their funds offshore. So none of the funds are captured in those small economies. They are virtually making money and taking it out of the economy and suppressing the economy there. The people become poor. Then there is the land mobilization process, whereby people are asked to free up their land for business development purposes. So when people are moved from their land, they become a landless people. And then this whole process creates the very poverty that the sponsors of free trade argue that they are freeing our economies of. It's one of the things that I'm very concerned about. Free trade is currently being negotiated in very covert manner. It's negotiated behind closed doors by very clever economists and lawyers and accountants and so forth. There is no consultative process. Many of the governments of these small economies have no idea how to negotiate trade. They don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal or the expertise to be able to look further into the ramifications and repercussions of such a negotiation and what comes out of it. And they often do not negotiate in such a way that it benefits the economy. At the end of the day, they live with nothing, and those who negotiate more vigorously, with greater knowledge and tact, and with shrewd cunning, walk away with the better benefit. The fact of the matter is that free trade is being negotiated by the governments that are sponsored by corporate interests. Because increasingly, Western countries are being sponsored by corporate interests. They can then design policies that will suit corporate interest. What is corporate interest? Profit and greed. That's what it is. And who is corporate interest? Well, if you look at it, it's a small, minute percentage of another percentage that actually control the world by financial and economic manipulation. Just a small group. And why should we agree to something which is going to marginalize us but benefit them instead? Well, these are considerations that we as governments of the Pacific must make. We must truly represent the interests of the people.
Also, probably the biggest, most pressing issue for the Pacific, although if you followed the Western media, you probably wouldn't believe it, is West Papua. How would you describe that conflict?
Well, you see, in West Papua, you have an estimated population of almost 2 million people. These are Pacific Islanders. No matter how we look at it, and just because the United Nations in 1967, the decolonization program, decided to rule a line and give West Papua, illegally by the way, to Indonesia, that does not make them non-Pacific people. They are still Pacific people. How could we have a Pacific plan when we don't include them? You know, and there is a lack of information about what's happening in West Papua right now. The Indonesian army's brutality, murder, rape, torture, maiming, all of this evidence is on the internet right now. And there's much of that evidence and anecdotal and real evidence that's available to anyone. And yet no one in this region, Australia, New Zealand, for example, is making an effort to say anything about that. They can go and cry in Boston for 3 people who died, and they can say what a terrible tragedy, and they can vow to fight for the terrorists, to capture the terrorists there. And in fact, they've caught 2 of them. But right in their own back door, they're not able to look at the West Papua situation. Now, in West Papua, almost on a monthly basis, you are seeing the deaths of many West Papuans who have been tortured, killed, brutalized, and so forth by an oppressive Indonesian military. What is being done about that situation? They are Pacific Islanders. If we claim to be representative of the Pacific, as Australia and New Zealand always insist, then how come they're not looking at this situation? How come they're not addressing that problem?